Hello. In the Crown of Aragon 639 years ago, it was June 23rd, 1387. My name is Jonathan Seyfried. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of New Mexico, and this is the Historian's Notebook, a podcast about how history gets made. Season 1 is titled Multcara Compagnona. We're looking at a document from each day of the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. Although I should say that this is the penultimate episode of Season 1. We were doing a document a day for the first 6 months. Let's begin today's document. Well, I gotta say, documents like the one we're looking at today make me really tempted to go back on my decision and just keep going, doing a document a day for the whole rest of the year. But I am excited to get on to Season 2. I'm going to start preparing Season 2 pretty much as soon as this season is done, and I think it's a good trade-off because we might, even though we have really fun documents like the one today, I think have reached a certain level of saturation with the experience of looking at one document for every day during the first year of the reign of Joan I of Aragon and Violante de Bar. So today's document is from Joan. We're doing a document from Joan today, and then our last document is going to be from Violante, and that'll be tomorrow's episode. This particular document is from Register 1751. It's actually the next folio after the one we looked at yesterday. The two documents that are in full on this folio, they are both dated June 23rd, but I'm going to focus today's episode on the shorter one, the one that is in Catalan and not the longer one. Well, I'll talk about them both, but my full effort was put into the shorter one, and I put, mid-level effort into the longer one in Latin. Then there's a little snippet at the bottom that is another document that really has most of its content on the folio after this. And I think what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the short document in the middle, the one that I've really done a lot of research on. And then we'll talk about the longer one at the top and my speculations about it, because I honestly don't know who it is addressed to. So, yeah, there's that. The document in the middle, the one that's about 6 lines long, it has a clear addressee. At the bottom of it, there's an addressee line, Comitem Fuxien, or something like that. Fuxins. There's an abbreviation there, but basically it's the Count of Foix, and that would be Gaston Fébus. Gaston Fébus, and that Fébus is the French translation of Phoebus. Gaston Fébus has come up a couple different times on the podcast, but not for a little while. He was the Count of Foix-Bearn, which was a realm composed of a kind of smattering of territories in the Pyrenees Mountains. There's a really great biography, a scholarly biography of Gaston Fébus, and I think the title of it, not the subtitle, but the actual title of it, is Lord of the Pyrenees. So Gaston Fébus, he at this point was towards the end of his life. He lived until 1391. But he had become quite a famous and powerful count, and no one really messed with him. He had tried his mettle against a bunch of the different players during the 100 Years' War. So Edward the Black Prince faced off against Gaston Fébus, and Fébus came out ahead. I'm a little shaky on the details of that, but basically Gaston Fébus had done a fair bit of conquering and actually had a lot of money, had basically benefited from the 100 Years' War and had a lot of treasure. And so he spent it on cultural things. And one of the things that he did was he composed a book about hunting, medieval elite hunting, the art of hunting. And he called it the Book of the Hunt, or the Livre de la Chasse. And it's one of the most famous hunting treatises to come out of Western Europe during the Middle Ages. For one reason among many, one of the illuminated copies is quite resplendent. So the illuminated copy of the Livre de la Chasse that was produced, was it the Limbourg workshop? I think it was. I think it was the same workshop that did the Book of Hours from the Duc de Berry, but don't quote me on that. But it was an illumination that was at that level of intricacy and artfulness. And so this particular book on hunting has survived into the modern era, and it's quite easy to find the browsable online copy, and I'll put a link to that into the show notes for today's episode. But the Book of the Hunt, the Book of the Chase, was one that was immediately copied and recopied, and I'm pretty sure that Joan had already, by this time in 1387, read this book by Gaston Fébus. And Joan and Gaston Fébus had a very long correspondence. They were always sending each other things, cultural items, manuscripts, books of music, and the troubadours themselves. And that brings us to today's document, where this short 6-line document is conveying that Joan is sending 2 troubadours to Gaston Fébus. In the first line, they are identified as Henri and Venegui, or Veneki. Not quite sure about that name and what it might translate to into English. Veneki. This particular document has been fully transcribed in the collection by José Trenxodeña and Ignacy Bajes y Hardy. And they put together a big document collection of different letters and billing records, financial records, and all kinds of various documents that have to do with music during the reign of Joan and Violante. And we've looked at some other letters that have been transcribed by them in this collection during the course of the podcast. So these 2 particular troubadours, or minstrels, they are named in the first line, and then in the second line, they are identified according to the musical instruments that they play. And it doesn't really say which one plays which instrument or whether they play them both. The instruments are identified as the shawmia and the bombard. And the shawmia is actually the medieval Catalan word for an English word, shawm. So if you've heard the word shawm, That is the kind of oboe-like instrument that is almost at this point like a stereotype for medieval music. And then the bombarda, it's not the same as a shawm, but it's also in the general idea of what would later become the oboe. So it's a reed instrument, a double reed instrument. The bombarda is an instrument that has a lower pitch than the shawm. And now you have reached the height of my knowledge, the extent of my knowledge of musicology and the history of music. I found in my research for today's episode a really wonderful book on the history of the recorder, the musical instrument, the recorder. And in it, there's a whole chapter on the medieval recorder, and that's a different instrument than the shawm, than the bombarda, but it gives you in this book the full rundown in English of Joan's musical instrument endeavors, his efforts to collect and have custom-made all kinds of musical instruments. The historian of music that wrote this is David Lasaki. And if you're not able to get a hold of the book, then there's actually an English language journal article that is on a German journal's website. Is that a tongue twister? Yeah, it's called Windkanal, like wind canal. So Windkanal. So I'll put a link to that in the bibliography for today's episode so you can look at some of David Lasaki's research. And David Lasaki, he works from a lot of secondary sources that I have also used. So works by Maria del Carmen Gomez Montané. And also there's some books on Guillaume Machaut, and let's see, I feel like there's one other that I'm forgetting, but anyway, he has consulted a lot of works that I too have looked at, but this is really the best English language summary of Joan's musical endeavors that I have come across. So highly recommend. And it's really fitting that in this second to last episode of the Historian's Notebook Season 1, Molto Cara Compagnona, that we're looking at a document that has to do with Joan's cultural interests, that has to do with music, because this really is the highlight in terms of Joan's legacy in history, that he was such a patron of music and the arts. And my argument is that you can't just look at Joan alone. You have to see this as a collaborative project between Joan and Violante. They carried out this project together. They each used their social network connections and whatever funding they could get their hands on to obtain these cultural items and to pay performers and writers to have this cultural focus in their reign. Financial responsibility be damned. They didn't care about where the money was really coming from or how. I mean, if they cared about that, they probably would have apprehended that there was a lot of fraud going on in their administration in the treasury. So what you tend to see, and it really comes through, it comes through so strongly in this work from David Lasaki, that it's a focus on Joan alone. Violante is mentioned, but her network connections, they're not gone into in any detail. And then we see in the scholarship on Violante that And I think Claire Ponsic and her work is a really good example of this, because she has written a bunch of pieces about Violante and Violante's cultural interests. But we could also go back to earlier works such as Isabelle Riquer, where they're focusing on Violante's cultural endeavors in a way that doesn't really involve Joan too closely. So I think there's been a real biographical focus. I think also that if you're looking at this in the context of how Violante was completely overlooked, I mean, they both are pretty much overlooked, but in terms of having no biography until Dawn Bratch Prince wrote in a Castilian language biography of Violante, there was no biographical treatment of Violante. There were a few of Joan, like we've talked about, Josep Roca in the 1920s and Rafael Tassis y Marca in the 1950s, but there was nothing for Violante until pretty much the 1990s. And so it makes sense that there would be an interest and a very good reason to focus on bringing the life and work of Violante de Bar into scholarship. And so that's perfectly justified. But I think we're at the point now where we've got a lot of material on Violante de Bar alone, and with a focus on her letters and choices. And now what we can do is we can take a look to see how much Joan and Violante were in this cooperative arrangement, how much they were collaborating, and how each of their missions, their cultural goals, were achieved because they were doing this together. And not every medieval king and queen operate like this. There is actually probably 80% or more of the marriages among medieval elites. They're off doing their own thing. They don't like to interact with each other, often because they don't like each other because they were in arranged marriages. They didn't know each other often before they got married. There's definite exceptions to this, but for the most part, it's uncommon to see in a medieval king and queen a strong desire to do collaborative projects. So that's, I think, what makes this whole project an interesting one. And the whole journey that we've been on is trying to see what evidence exists for that particular interpretation of Joan and Violante. Guess what? Today's document, on its own, no evidence. It doesn't help at all. But what if we were to find in one of Violante's registers a mention of this Henri or Veneki or the particular instruments? Well, that would be interesting, especially if it was around this same time. And this is where we come back to the AI discussion, which is that when these documents become full text searchable, then we're going to be able to really find out what evidence there might be for this whole theory I have about the level of cooperation between Joan and Violante. Let's talk about the AI for a second here before we get to the document that's at the top of this folio. This particular document was put through the OpenClaw pipeline, this register, and I have to say that disappointing result. First of all, the Latin document, almost nothing came through correctly in the end. So bad. This particular document, Gemini, the one that's the Catalan one in the middle, Gemini did okay. I mean, it gave up. I mean, it only transcribed like half the words. Is that even okay? No, I don't think that's okay. Just go back on that. It was Claude that did okay, but it missed the names of the instruments. It was just not that good. So, this is one that had already been transcribed by Tranks Odenia and by Hasey Hardy. So, I already had a very clear idea of what the paleography was in this document. So, yeah, not sufficient for carrying out the research goal here in terms of getting some full text search capability. This is a good example of the current limitation when it was done in this automated way. But my guess is that just 2 years down the road, a similar kind of agentic AI process will result in much higher quality, if not close, something like 95% correct transcription. All right, let's round out this episode with a mystery. The addressee line for the document, that is the first half of this folio 70R, it says Fuit Missa Regi, a king. It was sent to some king, but it doesn't say which king. I am just going to throw out there that I think that this is the King of France. But I don't know. That France is mentioned in, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines from the bottom. But it's basically saying something similar to what's in the document to Gaston Fébus. This particular section of the Latin letter, I think, is actually communicating that it's almost like a Latin translation of what's in Catalan, where in the Catalan letter, Joan specifies that the 2 troubadours have come from France. Oh, by the way, I just want to quickly say that some looking at this as I'm talking might be confused because it says portadors in the first line, but it says portadors de la present. So it means the carriers of the present letter. So they're not their job is not portador or porter. Joan is just saying that they are carrying the letter. That's all. All right. So anyway, so is it the same 2 troubadours that are being sent to somewhere else? I think that the addressee cannot be the Count of Foix, because then that person would not be identified in the addressee line as a king. So I think possibly the idea is that the troubadours are going to hang out with Gaston Fébus, Henry, and Veneki. They're going to hang out with Gaston Fébus, and then after that, they're going to go to France. And I think that the first document on this folio is probably addressed to the King of France. That would be my guess. There is something else to point out about this document, that on line 7, we have the phrase convalescentiam corporalem, a bodily convalescence of the body. So Joan is saying that he's feeling better, and he's, thanking God for it, I think. And so this is just an interesting note about how Joan refers to his own illness and his recovery from that illness. So he is using this word convalescence in Latin. And, I just want to point that out because it's not every Latin letter that we see here that Joan, he's referring to his own health condition. So, well, I don't know what to make of it really, whether I should give additional trust to that statement there, or whether he's worried about the rumors that have circulated around all the way to Paris, maybe. So that is something that we'd have to come back to later if we do a more careful transcription and translation of this Latin document. I do also want to point out one more thing, that on the left there's a little marginal note, and at the top I can't read what the first little word is, but the second word is fuit, and then the second line has expedita. So this was sent in an expedited way. Not quite sure what that means, how much faster that might be. But there was some kind of expedited process regarding that document. Well, thanks for listening to this penultimate episode of The Historian's Notebook, Season 1, Molt Cara Compagnona. If you are leaving with more questions than you arrived with, I've done my job. Because remember, the motto of The Historian's Notebook is dissatisfaction guaranteed. Why? Because if there's some piece of history out there where the person who's creating it is saying, I have answered all the questions, then that is some bad quality history. Good history always raises more questions, always leaves you wanting more. Speaking of wanting more, visit the website to see an image of today's document and additional show notes, and listen again tomorrow for our last episode of Season 1, when you will hear about the next day in the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violante de Bar. In the meantime, take care.